Kirby Smart is the best coach in SEC football. I think that much is accepted at this point. But who would be the second best coach in the conference? A shakeup in the coaching community after the retirement of Nick Saban and Jim Harbaugh off to the NFL. Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John and I today will do a little coaching draft in the SEC as we start to try to figure out, once you get past Kirby, who would you want as your coach from the available options in this conference? Also, we'll touch in on the investigations, the NCAA investigations into Florida and Tennessee, both reportedly pertaining to NIL. How serious do we think those are or could be for each of those two programs? So first, John, let's start with the coaching situation. I think this time a year ago, you could have had a hearty debate whether Nick Saban or Kirby Smart was the best college football coach in this moment. Kirby had won back-to-back national titles, but Saban had the 7 rings overall and was still a monster on the recruiting trail. Well, now with Saban out of the picture, Kirby's number 1, right? And then it gets a little murkier. But before we get into kind of this setting the stage for the scene around the conference and pecking order of coaches, just how do you see the level of coaching talent overall right now in college football in the aftermath of Nick Saban and Jim Harbaugh exiting the scene?
Well, the fact that Nick Saban exited, I don't see how you can say it's the coaching is as good as it was, because you're talking about arguably the greatest coach of all time. It's just like when Bobby Bowden retired at Florida State, Bear Bryant. Those two kind of stick out to me. When Bear Bryant retired at Alabama, those guys were at the very top. I guess you could add Joe Paterno to that. I wasn't a big Joe Paterno fan. A lot of his victories came in a watered down conference. But yeah, when you lose somebody like Nick Saban, I don't think overall you can be as good because you don't have that shining star at the top, Nick Saban, that nobody can argue about. You may have a bunch of good coaches. I think you have overall in the SEC, you have a lot of good coaches now, and some bad ones. But overall, I think it's pretty good. You just don't have that clear-cut number one. However, if you say who's the number one coach in college football, I think you got to go with Kirby Smart, not just for the SEC. And so there you have it in the SEC that the number one coach, Nick Saban, retires, and the number one coach in the country is still in the SEC. That tells you something about the strength of the conference.
Do you think, John, do you think college football lost 2 of its best 3 coaches? Obviously, Saban would have been in the top 2. People would have ordered them in some order of Kirby, Saban, or Saban, Kirby. So it lost 1 of its top 2. But when you add Harbaugh on the heels of this national championship into the mix, do you think that 2 of the top 3 now are gone, or would you have put someone else in that number 3 position? Not necessarily, doesn't have to be from the SEC, but anywhere, nationwide in college football, would you have put someone else in that top 3 mix with Saban and Kirby?
I guess if I were ranking coaches, let's just say, those guys are all back. If I were ranking coaches in the moment, I would have gone with Kirby Smart. And I would have had Saban number 2 just in the moment. And who would I have ahead of Jim Harbaugh? Maybe your guy, Kalen DeBoer. But I think the fact that Jim Harbaugh's done it at a couple of places, and what he did there in Michigan, when he came there, Ohio State was rolling, and Ohio State lost another legendary coach in Urban Meyer. And I still call on schools throughout the country to offer him a job. But So I would probably, but Harbaugh, what he's done there and the way he's turned that series around. Ryan Day is another successful coach. Steve Sarkisian is too. Um, of late, Mike Norvell, I guess, but Kalen DeBoer, I can't think of anybody I would really put ahead of Jim Harbaugh. So I think it's fair to say you can argue about Harbaugh, but I think it's fair to say that college football lost two of its top three coaches.
Let's do this, John. And instead of ranking SEC coaches 1 through 16, let's put aside, I guess, sort of the bottom half of coaches in the conference, and we'll do this draft style. Our listeners know John and I like to do a handful of drafts per year, whether we're drafting coaches, quarterbacks, rivalries, what have you. So as we do it here, we'll do snake draft style, and we're going to try to each draft the best collection of 4 coaches. So we'll get 4 apiece. We can't duplicate our picks, and whoever gets the number 1 pick, the other person will get the next 2 picks. We have randomly assigned the number 1 overall pick before we started recording here, and I get the number 1 pick. And so I'm not going to shroud it in mystery. Of course, we've been discussing Kirby Smart is now the unquestioned best coach in college football. That means he is the best coach in the SEC. So as I build my 4 coach depth chart here, I'm taking Kirby number 1 overall. I think he's the best motivator in the sport. I think with Nick Saban out of the picture, he's the unquestioned best recruiter in the sport. I think you could have maybe made that argument even with Saban in the fold, but now with Saban out, it's undoubtedly Kirby is the best recruiter in the sport. And I think he's pretty good X's and O's tactician as well. There may be a few guys that could be in his realm of X's and O's, but when you add it all up, motivation, recruiting, X's and O's, intangibles, the whole package, I mean, Kirby Smart has to be first off the board. Would have been interesting, I guess, to see who I would have picked. Maybe I might have had some pause if Saban was still in the picture. Do I go Kirby or Saban if I just got 1 year to go for it? I don't know. I don't have to answer that question anymore. That's sort of the point, right? Saban's out of the picture. Kirby's number 1.
Yeah, I would have done the same thing. You have to put Kirby number 1, and if you're drafting coaches nationwide, you should put Kirby number 1. The job he's done in recruiting, he's won. I mean, let's face it. We know how hard it is to win 3 consecutive national titles, and he couldn't pull that third one off. But it wasn't as though he fell way short. He lost a 3-point game to Alabama in the SEC championship game. And does anybody really think that if Georgia had gone into that playoff, that it wouldn't have been the favorite? I would argue that. I think it would have been the favorite. It might have won the whole thing again. It's harder. The SEC championship game has helped the SEC in that final poll or in that final determination of a national championship many times. This season, it hurt it because if you hadn't had the championship game in the conference, Georgia would have represented the SEC. And while I give Alabama all the credit in the world for winning that game, Georgia was it was a better entrant to go all the way. We know that. Yeah. So now I get the second and third picks. It's a little bit harder than your choice, and you might not even have these 2 guys. I go with Brian Kelly. He's caught heat for what he's done at LSU his first 2 seasons, but he won 10 games in taking over for Ed Orgeron. And as we know, LSU he wasn't taking over 15-0 national championship LSU from Ed Orgeron. He was taking over a program that was reeling, that plummeted quickly under Ed Orgeron. So to win 10 games and beat Alabama and play in the SEC championship game his first year, I thought was significant. This season, it was hard to understand how LSU could be as bad as it was defensively. It had a national championship offense, and a Vanderbilt's defense. And you don't think that's possible at LSU with the athletes it recruits, but that was the case, and he gets
Well said.
he gets some scrutiny for that. However, bottom line, he's had back-to-back 10-win seasons in his first 2 seasons. He'll be good again next year, and he's leading the way in recruiting for that top 25 class. I mean, we're looking at a guy who is like 10 wins could be the floor for him, for Brian Kelly. So couple that with the fact that he's won everywhere else he's been. He took Notre Dame to the playoff twice. So he'll be contending for a playoff berth every year. So I'd have Brian Kelly. Then I'd go with the Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin stock is rising significantly with me. How he's faring in this new era. I don't think anybody predicted this kind of success for him at Ole Miss. If we still had the old divisional situation in the SEC and you had the West and the East, after all the transfer dust is settled, I'd say Ole Miss would be my pick to win the West this year over Alabama or LSU or anybody else except Georgia, of course. So, yeah, I think he's done a tremendous job in the portal. He was having a great year in the portal. And then lo and behold, he picks up 2 offensive linemen from Washington as transfers. I mean, this was a preeminent offensive line in the country. Although when you watch the national championship game, you probably are thinking, I think Michigan has the best offensive line. That aside, it was honored for that. It had a terrific offensive line, and Lane Kiffin goes out and gets 2 starters from that offensive line after already probably adding as many as 7 or 8 defensive starters and helping his receiving core. I mean, he got the number 1 guy in the portal, and I think, was it Nolan, number 1 overall? The A&M defensive lineman, he's certainly ranked high. So when I look at Kiffin differently now. I mean, I always thought he was a really good coach, good offensive coach. But now I'm thinking the way he's adjusted to this transfer portal and the success he's having there at Ole Miss, a school that's not supposed to be doing that. So I go with Brian Kelly and Lane Kiffin. I'm not sure. Right now, I might take Kiffin first of the 2, but those are my 2 picks. So after that long soliloquy, you can pick your 2 guys.
Yeah, I would have taken Kelly with my next pick too. I mean, it's easy to, because he got such a fat contract from LSU, and because I think a lot of people still like to beat up on him for leaving Notre Dame when Notre Dame had a shot at making the playoff that year at the time he left. He made himself an easy target, so people like to criticize Brian Kelly. But to your point, he's not reached the pinnacle at LSU, but through 2 seasons, he's got 20 wins. I mean, that's pretty good. And I think the momentum is trending up. He's got 3 5-star recruits committed to this next recruiting class, including Bryce Underwood, the nation's number 1 overall quarterback prospect. So when you factor in he's averaged 10 wins per season in 2 years at LSU, and his best recruiting class is still yet to come, right around the corner here. The way he restructured his staff in the offseason, I think he made some good moves there, getting Blake Baker as his defensive coordinator, Bo Davis, the veteran defensive line coach who had been at Texas. Some really good hires, I think, to address that side of the ball. I'm with you on Brian Kelly. I think at number 3, I would have considered Lane, and I would have considered a couple other guys who you're about to hear, but I have no problems with that pick either. I think Lane certainly would have been in consideration for that pick for me. But so my second and third picks, with those guys off the board, I'm going to take Steve Sarkisian from Texas and Kalen DeBoer, the new man there at Alabama. I wish I could combine the talents of these guys, because I think if we're just talking pure X's and O's, Kalen DeBoer might be the best in college football right now. I mean, you think about what he had last year at Washington. Hey, he had a nice roster, no question about it, but he didn't have one of the top 2 rosters in college football, I don't think. and he takes them to the national championship game. Yeah, Michigan controlled that game, but still, Washington had a shot in the fourth quarter. He's 5-0 in his career against Dan Lanning and Steve Sarkisian. It's going to be an adjustment for him at Alabama, I think, no doubt about it, particularly with some of this exodus, here in the short term, guys hitting the portal. But I like what he's done over the course of his career. He's won at every level he's been. I think if they show him any patience at all, he will prove to be a good hire for Alabama. And then when it comes to Sarkisian, I just really like the direction he's got that Texas program going. He's a good play caller. He's a great recruiter. I mean, behind Kirby, boy, Sarkisian would be on my short list at this point for nation's best recruiters. He's been at multiple schools, and he had his issues in the past. Not all that was related on the field. When he departed Southern Cal, it was because of his off the field issues with alcohol. He rehabbed his image, proved himself as a coordinator for Saban. I really like what he's done as a head coach at Texas. I think that program is headed in a great place because of what he's done there. So yeah, it's with Brian Kelly and Lane off the board. To me, my next two picks are obvious, and Sark and DeBoer.
When you look at those 5 guys we've picked, I think they all rank in the top 10 nationally.
And maybe
that's a stretch.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe I'm being too provincial, but no question with Kirby, no question with Brian Kelly, having won wherever he's been. And now we have DeBoer and Sarkisian, playoff coaches. You look at DeBoer's overall record. Sarkisian's been at more than one school, had some success elsewhere. And you look at Lane Kiffin, he's one of the best coaches in the country who hasn't made the playoff.
I would agree.
Ryan Day's made the playoff at Ohio State, and he's had a really good record, but I don't know if I'd take Ryan Day over Lane Kiffin right now.
No, I agree. I think these 5 guys we've named, I think definitively would be in your top 10 coaches in college football. I look at the line of demarc. I mean, Kirby's in a class of his own, right? There's one man on the top tier in the SEC, and I almost put these next 4 guys on that same second tier. Now, you could argue Kelly, his overall career resume is better than any of the other guys on that list, and Kelly's had multiple runs at a national championship, so maybe he's on a tier unto himself, right behind Kirby. But I almost think you could lump him in at this point with Sarkisian, DeBoer, and Lane, and say there's your 4-man second tier in the SEC behind Kirby Smart, and then I think you have a couple more tiers after that I guess we'll sort of start to dive into the third tier for our next couple picks. So you get 2 more here to round out your 4-man coaching depth chart. Who would you take next to complete your coaching roster?
Well, I go with Josh Heupel of Tennessee, who's dropped off a little this year, mainly because he had a top 10 in his second season at Tennessee in 2022. I think there were questions about his recruiting ability when he came to Tennessee. He'd only been at UCF, and he'd been an offensive coordinator at Missouri and other places. But coaches usually recruit well at Tennessee. It's not going to rank 30th in recruiting. If you and I are the coaches, it will still rank in the top 30, I think. But I still think he's an offensive guy. He's one of the best offensive coaches in the country. I thought he did really well in the portal this year. I thought that was significant because he had some holes to fill. I think he filled them. So I feel pretty good about having him. Maybe he's right on the fringe of our big 5. He hasn't accomplished that, but he hasn't been a coach as long as he's got. Well, I guess he's been a head coach as long as DeBoer, probably. So,
well, depends whether we're including DeBoer's NAIA.
Yeah, So I would go with Josh Heupel, and then I would go with Hugh Freeze. which doesn't look real great when you check the SEC standings, what Auburn did, but your guy Brian Harsin didn't do Auburn any favors.
That's true. But Hugh he inherited a tough hand there. I think we'll be able to evaluate him as Auburn's coach a little bit better in years 2 and 3.
Yeah, really year 3, I think. So again, he's an offensive coach who did well. He did well at Ole Miss as a head coach, and he did great when the NCAA wasn't peeking over his shoulder. And he's won at other schools. So yeah, I think he qualifies. I mean, if you take excuse me, if you take the top 5 coaches out of most conferences, and then you still have Josh Heupel and Hugh Freeze, that says something about the depth of coaching in the SEC, I feel.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, there's a lot of programs in college football that would, well, if you put your scruples aside anyway, would like to have Hugh Freeze, and I think there's a lot of programs that would take Josh Heupel for sure. I agree with our prior assessment that they're not on at this point anyway. They're not on that second tier, but I think they are on that third tier, and I actually feel like there's a drop off at this point. It's not. I wouldn't put all the other guys in one lump, but I think another tier starts to form after you remove Heupel and Hugh from the equation, or at least as I tried to pick the final coach on my 4-man lineup here, I really am kind of struggling. I mean, I feel like there's 3 candidates. It's, do I want to cash in on Eli Drinkwitz on the heels of Missouri's 11-win season? Now, his 3 previous years at Missouri, he hadn't had a winning record. So I guess the argument for him would be, well, he did his best yet in year 4, so he's on the way up. It just took him a few years to lay the groundwork, and bright days ahead. I think I could make the case for Drink. I think another one would be Mike Elko, Texas A&M. After Elko's 2 seasons at Duke, he won 16 games in 2 years at Duke, and so again, I think that would be betting on upward momentum if I went that direction. But I'm actually going, and this one may surprise you, John. I'm going with, I guess, shall we call him Mr. Consistency, Mark Stoops. Now, sometimes I think Stoops is a little bit overrated in these national coach rankings pecking orders. I mean, there was a time when like a handful of national writers really had this infatuation with Mark Stoops, and it's like they thought he deserved a statue for going 7-6 at Kentucky. While I think that was a little bit much, I do think you look at it. I mean, he's kind of a machine at Kentucky, winning 7 or 8 games nearly every year. He's had 2 really good seasons where he won 10 games. And yeah, there's been times where the Kentucky schedule has been very accommodating. We've discussed that many, many times on this podcast. But I guess I'm going more for consistency and track record here rather than taking a risk on Drinkwitz or Elko. I know what I'm getting with Mark Stoops, and I feel like at this juncture of the draft, I just want a guy who is reliable. I know he's not going to have many terrible seasons, if any. You're gonna win some games with Mark Stoops, and if he was at a program other than Kentucky, maybe he would have won a few more games over the past few years. So I know you're probably going to push back on that one. Would you have? Who would you have gone with, John? Would you have rolled the dice with Elko or Drinkwitz, or maybe I'm wrong? Maybe you like my pick of Stoops.
No, I don't.
I didn't figure you did.
Yeah, and I give him all the credit in the world. Great, done a great job at Kentucky. A great humanitarian.
Of course.
Yeah, so we thank the world of him here in our podcast.
Uh-huh. So would you have gone Elko or Drinkwitz, or surely there's not someone else you would have gone with, is there?
I was thinking Billy Napier. Just kidding. No, I would go with Elko. The reason being, it's an unknown, but I like the potential there. I know what I'm going to get with Mark Stoops. I mean, we're down to, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is our 8th coach, so we're the middle of the conference, and that's
which
where
I feel like accurately describes Mark Stoops, Mr. Middle of the Conference.
He's a midsection guy. He's median. He's middle of the road, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can pretty much pencil in a bowl game with
Mm-hmm.
Mark Stoops. You can pencil in 7 wins, and when he wins games that I didn't expect Kentucky to beat Louisville. I thought Louisville was a better team, and Kentucky wins that game. He's done that before. He's won games that I didn't expect he would win. He's also lost a few I thought he would win, but overall, it's hard to argue with that. So put him in there right in the middle of the conference, and let's keep him there. But I want to do a little better than that. So, and Eli Drinkwitz, he had a great year. But there are other coaches in this league that have had great years, even better years. So this is a conference in which Ed Orgeron won a national title, and I'm not drafting him anytime soon. And I'm not drafting Les Miles, and he won a national title. So Eli Drinkwitz had a great year, all the credit in the world to him. But I would just take a chance on Elko. He's been in A&M as a defensive coordinator. He's supposedly a good recruiter, and he's got all that NIL money stockpile right behind him. So I think at A&M, I think he can win. And I just think in the next 3 years, A&M will finish ahead of Missouri and ahead of Kentucky. Now you could make the argument, well, what if Mark Stoops was at Texas A&M?
And he almost was, according
He
to multiple
almost was.
reports.
So maybe that, so yeah.
It's interesting, John. We're kind of debating between Stoops and Elko. I would go Stoops with that last spot on my roster. You're saying if it was your pick, you'd take Elko, and that was the debate Texas A&M was having when it was looking to replace Jimbo Fisher. Now, obviously, Ross Bjork, its AD, apparently wasn't all that enamored with either one of those guys because he vamoosed up to Ohio State after winding up with Elko, even waffling between Stoops and Elko, and just said, no thanks on either of these guys. I'll go be the AD of the Buckeyes.
Buyer's remorse there, I guess. He just, maybe he had that escape hatch already. Or maybe imagine this scenario. He's in the middle of making this decision. He hears from Ohio State. Well, I don't really care whom I hire here.
Yeah, what difference does it make?
Why should I waste any more of my time on this? Flip a coin and let it ride.
So our 4-man rosters there. I've got Kirby, Sark, DeBoer, and Stoops. You have Brian Kelly, Lane, Heupel, and Hugh. Your average, if you could average up our 4 coaches, I might like your average a little better. But hey, I've got Kirby ahead of my roster, so I'm just fine with my quartet there.
I've got a question for you on this. We both got our big 4 here. We all feel pretty good about that. We both do. Mm-hmm. So if one of those 8 coaches was hired at Vanderbilt tomorrow, which coach would do a better job at Vanderbilt of those 8 coaches?
I may surprise you with this. I'm going to go with Brian Kelly. Notre Dame and Vanderbilt. I mean, I'm not trying to compare the two, right? I mean, Notre Dame's the football blue blood, and Vanderbilt's Vanderbilt. But there would be no grumbling from Brian Kelly about, got to recruit to a certain academic standard here. I mean, Brian Kelly, he's used to dealing with the high brow, wearing his sweater vests, all buttoned up there at South Bend. So at least he would kind of know the culture of recruiting the nerds who can play football, and maybe he could get some of those nerds that were going to play for Notre Dame. Maybe get a few of them to Vanderbilt. I mean, I'm just trying to think of Kirby and Vanderbilt. Boy, I think Kirby's a great coach. When all is said and done, I'm going to go down as an all-timer. But Kirby and Vanderbilt, I don't see that marriage happening. Whereas I could see Brian Kelly. He knows that world a little bit.
You wouldn't be able to guess my pick. I think I'd take Lane Kiffin there.
Just make Vanderbilt transfer you?
Yes. My gosh, you're not going to out-recruit anybody. And he's got this great he's a beacon in the night for transfers. They just see him as a, their stepfather, so to speak. Lane will take care of us. He cares about transfers.
I may
He's a
not take
sec.
any of these guys, John. I might whoever's running the triple option the best. I mean, I've thought for a while, and I'm not the only one who's thought this, right? That Vanderbilt just needs to kind of say the heck with playing conventional football. Just be
Mhm.
like a military academy and try to cause opponents problems with the triple option. So I might leave all these guys out there and go find me the best triple option coach I could get in there.
That would be sad though,
Would
because
it? I love
coaches.
watching the triple option.
Well, no, I do too, but I'm thinking about from a coaching perspective. All these coaches love and look forward to having Vanderbilt on their schedule. It's their best chance of a win, other than if they're scheduling Chattanooga or Western Carolina. Nothing against those fine institutions, of course. Um, so yeah, I would think, if you put in the triple option, people don't want to play triple option teams. Why else did Danny White, Tennessee's AD, cancel a game with the Army? He didn't want to put up with the school because there's an unknown quantity there. On a good day, that triple option gets going. Your defense doesn't like it. You don't like it getting chop blocked and all that stuff. So yeah, I think people that would be very difficult. That would be a day of mourning for SEC coaches if Vanderbilt went to the option.
All the more reason why I'm
Oh,
I'm skipping
okay.
past all these guys and bringing in the option coach.
I got you.
All right, John, let's get into serious topics, or maybe they're not all that serious, but
So Vanderbilt wasn't a serious topic then. I
no.
apologize.
Yeah,
Okay.
Vanderbilt's not a serious topic. But NCAA investigations underway at University of Florida and Tennessee. Now, details are pretty scant at this point, but both reportedly pertain to NIL. Of course, we're probably a long way away from learning what any potential sanctions might be. We know how these investigations go. They can really drag on, and sometimes they produce big sanctions, sometimes they don't. For both of these schools, they're familiar with the NCAA. Florida has been investigated previously when Dan Mullen was the coach, got probation at that point. Tennessee, in the very well publicized long investigation on the heels of Jeremy Pruitt's tenure, Jeremy Pruitt got taken to the cleaners, got a 6-year show cause from the NCAA. Tennessee was found to have committed 18 level 1 violations at that time, and just a historically big rule breaking and sloppily carried out scheme. But Tennessee, in some ways, you could argue, got off light because they avoided the postseason ban, despite all the other sanctions that they and Pruitt endured. Tennessee avoided the biggie, the postseason ban. Now we have Florida and Tennessee under investigation again, this time, as I said, as it pertains to NIL. Now, the rules around NIL, since this has come aboard in 2021, have always been kind of murky. Like from day one, you're laughing. That maybe is an understatement. From day one, the NCAA has said you couldn't use NIL as pay for play, and you couldn't use NIL as recruiting inducements. Well, what constitutes pay for play? What constitutes recruiting inducements, right? And how do all these state laws factor into this? Now, Florida has said they're cooperating with this latest NCAA investigation and has not said much else. Well, Tennessee, Adam Sparks of the Knoxville News Sentinel, a member of the USA Today network, obtained an email from Tennessee Chancellor Dondi Plowman in which she had a scathing rebuke to NCAA President Charlie Baker about this investigation, which she called morally wrong, flawed, and that the allegations are untrue. Now, this is a much different tone than Tennessee took when it was under NCAA investigation last time and was firing Jeremy Pruitt. It acted like, the NCAA was its buddy then, and they were great partners in this investigation. Different tone this time around. So, generally speaking, John, how big, important, noteworthy are these NCAA investigations into Florida and Tennessee, and how worried do you think the football programs should be about these ongoing investigations?
Well, Tennessee should probably be a little more concerned because it just went through the Jeremy Pruitt era where recruiting was routine. I mean, illegal recruiting was routine, um, and it was not only not only was it prevalent, it was done at a kindergarten level, pretty much the way Jeremy Pruitt and his staff and his babysitter and wife and all the gang of outlaws operated. So that has to be a concern. Uh, this whole thing, though, goes back. Well, I was thinking I wasn't going to rip the NCAA, but how can you not rip the NCAA? It's such a great target. Uh, when the NCAA said, okay, NIL, we're going to have NIL, we're going to have transfer portal stuff, and the rules just change, keep changing. You say you're not going to, you can't use this as a recruiting inducement. Well, how is that possible when players know that they're going to get paid? How can you say, well, we can't tell you how much you're going to make here? It's just silly to think that you have to have a discussion. And it's the same way with transfers. Somebody's going to transfer to your school and they're going to come there just with no idea if they'll have a nice NIL package. It's just, it makes no sense. The NCAA jumped into this with no real thinking about how this could evolve. It just said, okay, we're going to do this. Here we go. Boom, we're into it. And that's why the Wild Wild West terminology kept coming up. Chaos is a prominent word when describing what has transpired in college football. So I just don't see how you can penalize a program for this. And also, how do you prove this? How do you
Yeah, I think that's the key, John, as you say it. And I might add a modification. I don't know if the NCAA jumped in; they were pushed in by
the
a series
court?
of a series of state laws in the courts. But
Mhm.
I think you hit on a big one there. Is do we believe, whether it be Tennessee, Florida, or otherwise, do we believe that some of this NIL stuff is inducements and pay for play? Yeah, I think that's pretty easy to believe that inducements and pay for play is going on. But believing that on some level it's happening and proving it are two different things. I mean, I'm thinking if you're trying to get me to come over to your house, John, for a dinner, and you say, "Hey, Blake, I'm inviting you over for a steak dinner, and by the way, Margot Robbie will be there," and immediately I say, "Well, yeah, John, I'll be there. When and where?" Now you could argue that inviting Margot Robbie and letting me know that she would be at dinner with me would be an inducement, but maybe that has nothing to do with my decision. Maybe I just wanted to come over, sit down with my friend John, and eat the steak dinner, right? And so I mean, I think it's going to be
Yeah,
really difficult to prove that some of this NIL activity that was happening, that this induced athletes' decisions. You know, the athlete could say, I just wanted to wear the power tee, or I just wanted to do the
sure.
gator chomp. And
Mhm.
if I happen to fall backward into millions of NIL dollars, well, all the better. But I just wanted to be gator chomping or singing Rocky Top, and all this other stuff was just an added bonus that really didn't influence my decision.
We'll see. The timeline of this is so important. So you're a high level recruit. First of all, kudos to me for getting Margot Robbie, who is one of my. I'm a
Yeah,
fan. Okay,
sure.
I don't think it's mutual, but I'm still a fan of her. Kudos to me for getting her to come to my home.
Yes, and eat
Okay,
eat your steak that you've prepared.
yeah. Oh, that's a great thought.
I
Um,
don't think you're probably inviting me in that situation, but anyway, we digress.
no, excuse me for being starstruck, Margot, but um, she's a good actress too. She's not just
No,
Yeah, I mean that was one of the. See, I didn't just invite her to my home because she was, some might say, physically attractive.
some
No,
might.
some might, but that's subjective. Because of her accomplishments. Look at her resume. My gosh, all the varied roles. But when when you're talking about a recruit, the moment he decides to commit to a school, okay, how are you going to be able to pinpoint his commitment? I mean, I don't see how you can do that. When his moment of commitment, he commits to the school. Okay. So you have not, let's say you've made that commitment, but you don't know what you're getting there. You make that commitment. So once he's committed, now of course he could change, but he's committed oblivious to what he might receive financially.
Yeah, wink, wink, oblivious, right?
Yes, wink, wink, of course. But we're talking about proving this.
Mm-hmm.
How are you going to prove that? And so then he said, and they said, okay, well, now that you've committed to our program, maybe you want to talk to the folks in our collective, which is just can't wait to make you a rich person and your family. So was it really it? No, you could argue that no, it wasn't a recruiting inducement. He wanted to come here. And now we're telling him how he can be rewarded financially from being a player at Tennessee or Florida, Alabama, Georgia, wherever. That's going to be impossible to prove. You would have to be there almost with him. I don't see how.
The
I mean,
only
we're
thing would
talking
be, John, is if this was like done really sloppily. I mean, you referenced the Jeremy Pruitt
Jerry.
situation. That was done so sloppily. Like it didn't take a crack staff of investigators to prove that Tennessee was cheating on the recruiting trail with Jeremy Pruitt. Now, how sloppy were these collectives? How sloppy were these NIL offers? Did they take safeguards to try to make it seem like these NIL deals weren't recruiting inducements, weren't pay for play? And that is maybe what we'll come to find out from these NCAA investigations. Did these collectives and anyone even tangentially involved with them, did they take measures to kind of cover their tracks enough to where you could argue that these deals are not inducements, are not pay for play? That, I think, is what remains to be seen, is because if you covered your tracks reasonably well, if you're kind of doing as you said, making sure to try to at least by appearances make it seem like you can make the argument that these aren't pay for play, that these aren't inducements, then I think they are sort of hard to prove.
I think they're very hard to prove. I mean, are you gonna get bank statements when money was deposited in somebody else's account? Uh, how do you? I mean, look, the NCAA couldn't figure out how to fire coaches who were on a FBI wiretap breaking rules. And it took them 3 or 4 years to figure out that, did they do anything wrong? I don't know. Maybe it's kind of hard to tell. Wiretap recordings. And now I don't think the consummation of a deal with a player was recorded, video recorded, and you shop it around to your boosters as a, hey, look what we did. Jeremy Pruitt might have done that, but Jeremy Pruitt isn't a picture. So I just don't think you can prove it.
But you started this by saying, like, because they've been under investigation in the past, it's not a total nothing. So I guess kind of tying a bow on this, John, if you were to say 1 through 10, with 10 being really, really, really concerning for either Tennessee or Florida, and 1 being this is absolutely nothing. If you're a fan of these schools, you can completely laugh at this, chuckle all the way, and call it a complete joke. I mean, what's your 1 through 10 scale here, and does it, I guess, differ from one school to the other?
Yeah, it differs a couple of reasons. With Florida, the way the football program's going now, back-to-back losing seasons in the Billy Napier era, makes me kind of wonder, were they really sloppy with this too? I mean, their product on the field often looks sloppy. Maybe they were sloppy with this too. Maybe they had Jeremy Pruitt working as a consultant or his babysitter. I don't know, or his wife. Who knows? With Tennessee, I would be a little bit concerned simply because of your reputation. I mean, administrators worry about this. I don't think the fan base really cares, but I think maybe the administrators worried, like, hey, we're not some outlaw program. We had Jeremy Pruitt in here, and we got rid of him as fast as we could, and this has nothing to do with that. So, but because you got one penalty already, and now right on the heels of that, you got an NCAA investigation. I would say for Tennessee, maybe a 4 on a 10-point scale.
So Tennessee's a 4. Did you give a number for Florida? Did I hear that
Yeah,
as
just
about a
because
3?
of sloppiness, potential sloppiness going on there. You've seen the Gator offense against
I've seen their
Oregon
special
State.
teams too.
Yeah,
Even worse.
that Oregon State game in the bowl, that always comes to mind with me. That when I think Billy Napier era, I see Florida kicking a field goal at the end of a game to avoid a shutout. That was pretty pathetic. Really sad for Florida football. But so I would just give them both a 4.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll continue to follow these as they unfold. As I mentioned, NCAA investigations tend to drag on, and it appears as if these two are in early days. And we'll have more drafts and rankings, I'm sure, as the offseason unfolds. But for now, thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.